God's sovereignty versus man free will. This is a kind of a hairy subject sometime when it comes to the difference between Calvinism and non-Calvinism. In our last video, we started talking some about God's sovereignty. I believe that God is sovereign, but he also sovereignly decides that we can make some choices. So I just wanted to make another video here to look at a few places where we see how God sovereignly works his plan through our free will. God's sovereignty goes along together with our free will, and this is not compatibilism. Compatibilism is the idea that you have free will and God is sovereign, but that definition is that God meticulously controls and determines everything. I don't think that's right, because basically it comes down to it's determinism. It's not really free will at all. I believe we do have libertarian free will. We can make choices, but God is still sovereign in the process, because as we make these choices, ultimately his overall will be done. And I think that's the correct way to look at the Bible. I just want to look at a few passages with you and see some places where I think this has actually happened. Let's go first of all to Daniel chapter 1. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God. So here is King Nebuchadnezzar coming in and destroying Jerusalem and fighting against them and taking the Jews over a period of 3 different deportations, taking Jews to Babylon and destroying the city of Jerusalem. Well, how could this be? Look in Daniel chapter 4. How could God allow this to happen? Daniel 4 in verse 25, it says this. This is when Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to be humbled by God because of his pride. It says, they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, for they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven till 7 times shall pass over you, to know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. God was using Nebuchadnezzar. How was God using Nebuchadnezzar? Well, he was bringing the Jews into captivity for 70 years because for so long they had refused to perform their Sabbaths and things that they were supposed to do. And God is going to get that back from them. So does that mean that God caused Nebuchadnezzar to sin? No, Nebuchadnezzar was making his own choices in response to the Jews' own choices, but God was working all these things out. You say, how can that be? How can that be? And we're going to talk about this here in a little bit, but God knows how people will act in certain situations. He knew that Nebuchadnezzar sitting on the throne and having the opportunity to go in there and destroy Jerusalem, God knew that he would do it. God has this plan, but he's using Nebuchadnezzar's free will choice to be able to do it. Look at Acts chapter 2. Acts 2:23 says this. This was Peter's sermon at Pentecost. He says, men of Israel, verse 22, men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested by God to you by miracles, wonders, signs, which God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves also know him, being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God, you have taken by lawless hands, have crucified and put to death, whom God raised up, etc. So what he's saying here is that that Jesus came, and according to God's overall plan, you guys of your own free will, you delivered him up. So it says foreknowledge. You determined being delivered by the determined purpose and foreknowledge of God. Foreknowledge just means knowing something beforehand. That one's not too hard to figure out, even though sometimes it does get misinterpreted a little bit, quite a bit actually. But foreknowledge. But what does it mean by Jesus was delivered by the determined purpose of God? Doesn't that mean that God meticulously determined everything about the death of Jesus? Now, we know Calvinists, non-Calvinists alike, we all know that that God did determine for Jesus to die. That's not a question. There was no surprise there. God had planned that in response to our sin. He knew that. But at what point did he cause those individual people to kill Jesus? Because that's a sin. Did he call those people to cry out, crucify him? Because that's a sin. They're turning against Jesus. Did God, what's the deal here? Why? How did this happen? And this is how I think we can explain that. This is obviously, if you have an opinion, you can share it with me. But I think what it means is like I mentioned with Nebuchadnezzar, that God knew how people would act. He knew if Jesus came on the scene in this situation with these people and did the miracles, and the Jews hated him, and the Romans had this situation that was set up where, they wanted peace that was out there. He knew that all this happened, that if Jesus came on the scene, then these people would turn against him. God knew that, and that's how he determined this. I'm going to put Jesus there at this time, and that's how they're going to act. Now, if you want an example, I think of a little bit like a zookeeper. He takes this red meat and he throws it in there to the lions, and the lions eat it. So the question is, uh, did the zookeeper cause the lions to eat the food? No, he didn't cause it. He just threw it in there, knowing how they would act because there was something he wanted to be done. Now, I don't know how far you can extrapolate that example out, but it's just giving an idea of what I'm saying here. God knew exactly what would happen. God works out the circumstances whereby his ultimate will be done. Even we'll see that going down into the book of Revelation and all that, that God is going to work things out, but God is not going to cause us to sin. That's what the book of James says, that God doesn't tempt us to sin. He doesn't cause us to sin. Matter of fact, just as a side point, when we get to the Lord's model prayer and he says, deliver us from evil, I think that's part of the thing. What we're supposed to be doing, we pray in that is not God take all the evil out of my life, but I think the idea, or when he says, lead us not into temptation, lead us not into temptation, I think isn't saying that God does tempt us, but I think it's saying, don't allow those situations in my life that I'm not ready to handle yet. If you throw that meat in here, I'm going to pounce on it and eat it. Right? Just don't put that in my situation because I'm not able to handle that right now. It's recognizing our weakness. So I think that's what he's saying there. But that's a little bit here beside the point. I believe, though, God's sovereignty allows us to choose or reject obedience. We can be obedient or we can be disobedient, but God works through all that. A couple other passages to look at. I want to look at Jeremiah here. Jeremiah 7:23. He says, but this is what I commanded them, saying, obey my voice and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk in all the ways that I've commanded you, that it may be well with you. Yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but followed the counsels and dictates of their evil hearts and went backwards and not forward. So God had commanded them, you obey me, you listen to me, but their own evil hearts led them in the wrong way. So that's a situation where God is saying, look, this is what I want you to do, but you went the wrong way. Okay. Sometimes God always works his will through our free will. But here's a situation where God wasn't meticulously determined that they're going to do what's wrong. They were doing it out of the evilness of their own heart. Let's look at this one. Psalm 81 and 10. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide and I will fill it. But my people would not heed my voice, and Israel would have none of me. So I gave them over to their own stubborn heart to walk in their own counsels. God was not causing Israel to sin. God was telling them, come to me. And they, out of the evil of their hearts, decided they were not going to do it. How about Hosea? There's an interesting story right there. Hosea 11:7. My people are bent on backsliding from me. Though they call to the Most High, none at all exalt him. So they call him when they have a need, but they're not exalting him and they're not worshiping him. But look at, they're bent on backsliding from me, he says. These people are out of their own wicked hearts. They are desiring to do what's wrong. How about Zechariah 1:4? Zechariah 1:4. Do not be like your fathers, to whom the former prophets preached, saying, thus saith the Lord of hosts, turn now from your evil ways and your evil deeds. But they did not hear nor heed me, says the Lord. So over and over, we just see this, that they, these people were just turning away from God. How about when Jesus came on the scene? Jesus came on the scene. Luke 13, a little more familiar probably to you. Jesus says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing. How much I wanted to come to you, and you weren't willing. You weren't willing to come to me. I'm reading right now through Calvin's Institutes, and he mentions this. He said, basically, what he was saying was, people shouldn't use to say that God actually, wants people to do something that he hasn't determined for them to do. But I never really saw a good reason. He just said, you shouldn't use this as an example. And I thought, give me some reasons. I didn't see any reasons there. But here's Jesus saying, I just wanted you to come to me, but you didn't. Does that mean that God is powerless? No, he is powerful. He has chosen for us to be able to choose of our own free will to accept him, which doesn't mean we're great people. It just means we recognize his greatness and how we are not great. So the question then would be, why did he allow this? Why did he allow this? And here's a simple answer. And I almost even hate to say it because it seems so simple and so superficial, is that he didn't want us to be robots. You say, oh, roll your eyes, right? Of course, that's always the non-Calvinist response. God didn't want us to be robots. But it's true. He wanted us to be able to make our own decisions and willingly choose to trust him. I mean, I get more glory when my children decide that they will trust me rather than if I just made a bunch of robots and they just have to do everything I say. God ultimately gets glory when we, of our own free will, choose to follow him and trust him and obey him. When we choose to obey, he receives glory. If my wife has a Roomba, it's the button and it goes off and it vacuums the floor, right? She doesn't go around bragging, oh, look, my Roomba obeys me. No, it can't help it. It's the way it was designed. It's the only thing it can do. God didn't design us that way. God designed us with the ability to choose, and he gets more glory when he chooses. Unfortunately, sometimes we sin. We get off the track. We go the wrong way. Why does God allow this? Why did God make us with a free will? Why didn't God just make what we had to obey? Part of the reason is, I think when he forgives, when we sin and he forgives, he gets more glory from that. If we had never sinned, then we would never know about his forgiveness. That'd be part of his character that we never would know anything about. He would not be able to extend that to us. So he gets glory when he forgives. And then, of course, he also gets glory when he punishes. That doesn't mean he enjoys punishing, but it shows how just he is. Our sin will eventually show his mercy, and it'll show his justness, if I can say it that way. So there's a theme through the whole Bible, which is one of the main reasons that I reject Calvinism, is that in the whole Bible, I see over and over, the Bible is dripping with free will, with choice. You need to make the right choice. You need to decide to obey. You need to choose correctly. If God being sovereign meant that he determines everything, then what do we do with the free choices? What do we do with sin? James 1:13-14, I alluded this earlier, says, let no one say when he's tempted, I'm tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone, but each one is tempted when he is drawn away of his own desires or his own lust and enticed. He doesn't tempt us and he doesn't make us do it. I want to just end with one more right here. This is Romans chapter 1. So many good things to understand this. Romans chapter 1 says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That is so crucial, so that they are without excuse. People are without excuse. When we sin, it is completely our fault. We can't blame it on God because he gave us the ability to choose. I think that Calvinism has a serious problem when it comes to this issue of sin. And I'm sure there's plenty of answers for it. But if God determines everything, then he determines sin. Of course, some say that God doesn't determine everything. He only determines who will be saved. And I want to know why. Why stop there? I'm guessing the answer would be total depravity. But there are other reasons I don't believe in the Calvinistic definition of total depravity. I believe we do have a propensity to sin, but not that we're necessarily guilty of Adam's sin. We will sin, though, once given the opportunity. But the question here today is God sovereign? The answer is yes, but we have to define sovereign. Sovereign means that God can do anything that is within his nature. It doesn't mean he always makes use of that sovereignty. All right. Well, there you go. There's another video for you. I hope I will see you on the next one. God bless.